This is the 21st of November, 1975. It's 15 hours and 15 minutes, past 15 hours, and we're in the home of Reverend Peter Letchford and his family in Albany, New York.
First, I'd like to say a few words about George Suckling, whom I first met in what was then Northern Rhodesia, in the Solwezi district, in 1944. George Suckling was then in charge of the Chitokoloki mission station in what was then the Balavali district of Northern Rhodesia. We met because of our common interest in African education. George Suckling had initiated at Chitokoloki one of the few upper middle schools, that is to say schools which had what were then known as Standards 5 and 6. And one of the projects that was before me at that time was the beginning of a similar school in the Kaondi area to serve the Solwezi and Kasempa districts. As the years went by, we had a warm, friendly relationship, both personally and in terms of the work which we were both involved in. There came a time, I would think it would be probably in 1947, when we began discussions on the desirability and practicality of beginning a school which would carry on the education of Africans beyond the Standard 6 level up through to university matriculation. In other words, I suppose one would call it a junior and senior high school, to which in due course we hope will be added a teacher training department, similar to that then being operated at Chalimbana near Lusaka. The very tentative thinking of those days also included the possibility of the eventual addition of education at college level. We discussed the thing, formulated some tentative plans, chose a tentative site on the road running from Ndola to Mufulira, entered into some very initiatory discussions with various officials, both in the provincial government and in the Department of African Education. It was entrusted to me to make contact in England with various friends of Mr. Suckling, those who belonged to the same Christian group as himself, the Plymouth Brethren, known in Africa as Christian Missions in Many Lands. Mr. Suckling introduced me to two of these wealthy businessmen in England, and I had discussions with them on the question of starting this new educational institution. They were most interested and I think would have given very substantial backing financially to the project, except that I was unable to give them any personal assurance on my part that the institution's enrollment would be limited to those who subscribed to the theological doctrines of the Christian missions in many lands. They were convinced adherents of this group and felt that any money that they put into a thing like African schooling should be related to the propagation of their particular faith. While I was substantially in agreement with their theological position, I didn't feel that a school could be begun and then operated with any effectiveness if enrollment was restricted to those who would subscribe to the beliefs of that particular group. It would mean, on the one hand, that, as they used to say in China, rice Christians would come forward in great numbers, people, in other words, who profess to an experience either of conversion or of theological persuasion purely in order to get into the school, and abandoned the thing, of course, immediately on graduation. It also meant that we, on our part, would have to restrict, in what seemed to me to be an unreasonable manner, the enrollment of worthwhile students. On this issue, the whole thing foundered and was aborted at that point. When I arrived in the Solwezi district at Mutanda Mission in 1944, the situation so far as African education was concerned was roughly as follows. Missionaries of the South Africa General Mission had been in the area, I think, from about 1910, and between then and the time when I arrived, they had succeeded in transcribing the language and had done a good deal of evangelical work, had produced a few elementary reading primers, and had got a small network of village schools in operation. The teachers for these schools were Africans, and such of them as had had any training had received it at Chitokoloki in the Bala Valley district. My guess is that at the time that I arrived, there were probably 8 such schools being run in connection with the work at Mutanda Mission. The job which I went out to do at the invitation of the South Africa General Mission was one which they had been prompted to do by the then Department of African Education of the government of Northern Rhodesia, namely to expand this network of village schools, to develop out of that a system of central schools for students in standards 3 and 4. These would be self-sustaining boarding schools to which the students would go for 5 days of the week, returning home at weekends and coming in again for the next week. The teachers for these schools were also initially to be trained at Chitokoloki. Then, emerging from those schools, I was asked to bring into being a school offering standards 5 and 6, then known as an upper middle school, and to add to that at once a program for training the lowest grade of rural school teacher. Back then that was known as a T4 teacher. It was 1 year of training in addition to standard 4 in school. These teachers went back and were able initially to take charge of the outlying rural schools. So this was my first assignment, and over the period of 5 years this was done. The central schools were, or rather should I say the elementary schools were increased in number. My guess is that we probably doubled them in those first 5 years. The central schools were brought into operation. The T4 program was initiated. Standards 5 and 6 were added, and from the standard 6, students began to go on to Munali Secondary School in Lusaka, or failing that to the Chalimbana Teacher Training School, also in Lusaka, where they could get the T3 or T2 qualifications, enabling them to come back and to take charge either of rural schools in preference to the T4 staff, or to take over the headmasterships of the central schools. I should mention that as things turned out, the upper middle schooling and the teacher training turned out to be a for men only business. Now this was not by planning. It was simply that coincidental with the developments at Mutanda, under my general direction, parallel work was going on at the Mukingi mission, 100 miles to the south, near to the Kasempa Boma, under the leadership of Miss Janetta Foreman. They did not actually have standards 5 and 6 for girls. There are no upper middle school, but they did have standards 3 and 4. I cannot remember at the moment if they did any teacher training there. As time went on, however, and especially after 1950, the work at Mutanda became increasingly coeducational, and the upper middle school in particular always had a number of girl students in it. The normal school or teacher training program at the T4 level was not very long-lived at Mutanda. We knew at the beginning it was only to meet a passing need in these early stages of developing education, and the Department of African Education in northern Rhodesia phased the thing out as soon as was practical, simply because the teachers were of fairly low attainments, and obviously no sound educational program could be developed until there was a better grade of teacher. At Mutanda, we did not embark on the T3 or T2 level of teaching, but instead sent our young men to Chalimbana for this grade of training. Or perhaps I should say either to Chalimbana or to Chitokoloki, which for a period also offered teacher training at the T3 level. Chalimbana, of course, being a government-operated school, is essentially a secular school, but this created, so far as I'm aware, no particular problems for students coming in from mission schools, nor for the missionaries that sent them in. As far as I'm concerned, I had the deepest respect for Mr. Maxwell Robertson, who was the then principal of Chalimbana. He was himself a former missionary, I think, of the Church of Scotland, a man of great ability, and in every way it seemed to me he was suited to lead such a school. And so both at Chitokoloki and at Chalimbana we felt that the young men got a sound training and came back with their convictions reinforced rather than undermined. I'd like to make a few further comments on George Suckling, who was one of the outstanding missionaries of the Plymouth Brethren, the Christian missions in many lands, builder and long-time leader of the mission station at Chitokoloki on the banks of the Zambezi. George Suckling was a man of great elegance. He was, I don't think, a very highly educated man. I don't think he was a man with any college or university training, but nevertheless he bore all the marks of good breeding and was what I would call a cultured man, a man of many parts, a man who was able to assimilate situations and analyze them and come to very eminently sensible conclusions on them. It goes without saying he was a man very deeply dedicated to his calling as a missionary. Under his leadership, there would be a grouping of younger missionaries who'd come to join him, most of whom were engaged in the task of evangelism in the Lavali and Lunda villages surrounding Chitokoloki, and in the program initially of elementary training in literacy, with a view to be able to reading gospel literature and simple versions of the scriptures, and thus of helping forward the work of establishing Plymouth Brethren assemblies in that part of the country. But George Suckling from the beginning had much wider horizons than this, and recognized, I think, that his commitment as a Christian was to help the African people in every conceivable manner. And so it was that at Chitokoloki, educational work developed further and faster than in any other point, I would say, in northwestern Rhodesia. He was the first to have a teacher training school at the T3 level. He was the first to have an upper middle school going up to standard 6. Moreover, he had a variety of training courses in the manual arts. Any builders that we had, African builders that we had in the Solwezi district, always turned out to have been trained at Chitokoloki. Any carpenters we had were trained at Chitokoloki. And indeed, one may almost say that any African that could do anything useful seemed to have found out how to do it at Chitokoloki. So George Suckling exerted an immense influence, I would say, on the early developments of the Kandi people. Another of George Suckling's achievements was to establish a leprosarium near Chitokoloki, which at one point, I understand, had as many as 1,400 lepers in it. And one of the very exciting developments was that as a result, of course, primarily of the advances made in the treatment of Hansen's disease and of the diligence with which George Suckling utilized these in the treatment through his hospital and through the doctors that were there of leprosy. As I understand it, the incidence of leprosy was immensely reduced in that part of the world to such an extent that in due course the leprosarium was totally closed down, and the few remaining lepers were sent to leprosariums in other parts of the country. Now can I say a word about the curriculum which we used in the various schools in the Solwezi district. I would say that up to and including Standard 4, we were conventional, and more or less had to be, because the schools were all financed by the government of Northern Rhodesia, and the Department of African Education quite rightly kept a pretty strict watch on the schools and on the people who were running them. And it was they who basically decided on the syllabus and published the syllabuses indeed, and also wrote the examination papers. So there wasn't room really for a great deal of latitude. There was good communication between the missionary educators and the provincial education officers, and I think we all felt that any of us who had initiatives to take or had any special ideas to present, there was no problem in presenting them, and as in due course as it seemed proper to the department, to getting them implemented. In one area, however, I found that something which I instituted didn't ultimately receive any official approval, and I think was dropped. And that was that in the upper middle school program, which was basically a 2-year program, standards 5 and 6, we introduced a third or middle year, which we called 5B, during which the students spent only about an hour and a half in regular classroom work each day. The rest of the day was spent on a program which we developed basically in 2 fields, agriculture and carpentry, though some students also learned building, and a few learned other things such as printing. We had a printing press there. My father-in-law was able to give the initial instruction in printing, and then John Wright learned enough of the printing procedures from my father-in-law to be able to carry on after he left. Now, the idea of instituting this additional year was to equip, as far as we were able, the young people going through our school to take their place in Zambian life or Northern Rhodesian life as it was then developing, and quite frankly to put them in a position where they could go out and earn as reasonable a living as possible, because merely to go through Standard 6, well, that led basically at that time to nothing much more than the teaching profession. In due course, the government instituted a school for the training of medical orderlies. This made yet another opening for the Standard 6 graduate. A little later than that, the African police force was substantially developed, and there were a considerable number of openings for Standard 6 fellows in the police school. But back in 1947, aside from going into the teaching profession or going into some sort of church-related work, the options were very small and the pay was fairly poor. I should mention, of course, that another opening was to be what was then known as a clerk, which was to be a sort of a secretary or filing clerk in one of the government offices. This was another favorite occupation of the Standard 6 graduate. However, good money was to be made in the carpentry and building trades, and for this reason, as well as for the fact that I felt it was a healthy thing to give every student the opportunity to be able to make something with his hands, to do something constructive in the practical line, rather than merely to grow up as someone whose idea of human development was restricted to getting more and more grades of education under his belt. We instituted this program, and for several years it was very successful. In the agricultural area, we had the very eager cooperation of the provincial education officer of those days, who was one of the great Moffat family and was himself, I believe, a great grandson of the Moffat who was father-in-law to David Livingstone. He gave us 6 easy steps for improving African agriculture, which we proceeded to pass on to these Standard 5 students. I mean, when I say simple, things like elementary rotation of crops, contour ridging, fertilization, seed selection, and so on. And the results of this were spectacular, to such an extent that some of the local chiefs called on me, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd year after we'd initiated this program, and besought us to take the program out into the villages and train the villagers in this way of agriculture. This proved to be impossible. We just didn't have the staff nor the time to do it, but one would hope that the young people themselves, having learned the benefits of these simple agricultural methods, would themselves take them back to their home communities. The training in printing, which of course is only given to 1 or 2 young people, we just had the one small press at Matanda, paid off, at least in this respect, that Maxwell Tepula, T-E-P-U-L-A, who was a Lamba from Uwera's village in Chief Kikora's area up near Kipushi in the then Congo, went into this as a profession in the office of the government printer, and eventually has risen, I think, to a position of leadership in that particular department. back again to the question of syllabus up to the Standard 6 level. As I mentioned before, the syllabuses were drawn up by the Department of what was originally Native Education, subsequently changed to African Education. And I would like to say that the men who manned this department back in the 1940s all seemed to be people of good caliber. In particular, one would single out Clifford Little, who was Provincial Education Officer, later became Principal of Manali Secondary School, and later Director of the Department of African Education. A man not only of great ability and insight and initiative, but of tremendous character and quality in every respect. Now, men of this caliber left their imprint on the syllabuses offered for use in the schools of northern Rhodesia, no matter by whom they were operated. And I personally found them entirely satisfactory, with one or two small exceptions, such as the one that I just enlarged upon, the introduction of this third year in the upper middle school. I felt then, I somehow feel the same now, that it doesn't do anybody any harm to regard education as something that's not merely associated with books or sitting at a desk or cramming your head fuller and fuller of all sorts of knowledge. I think the more that education can include the idea of the dignity of the manual arts, of their worthwhileness, and of the fact that life is much fuller if you can operate with something other than your brains, or make your brains operate in areas other than the purely academic, or in the area of pushing a pen. However, aside only from that, I found that the syllabuses themselves were of great merit, and even though I and later my colleagues served on an advisory board in Lusaka, at which it was possible to offer some input into all the philosophies and the content of African education, by and large we found these other fellows have gotten there first, and we felt little need to be innovative or overly creative. They'd already shown these characteristics, and it within the limits of the viewpoint of those days, which admittedly was mildly imperialistic, I suppose, and substantially paternalistic, within the limits of that viewpoint that was soon to become so outworn, maybe even then wasn't entirely justified. The syllabus offered in African schools, I think, was of great merit and of good quality. Let me just say one other word about innovations. I can't blame these on the South Africa General Mission as such. In a way, I suppose I have to admit that it was done without their consent and not really with their approval. But I personally came to the opinion that very early in the game we should get at least a few of the students, those who showed merit and capacity and potential in this area, out of the country for training that was just not available in northern Rhodesia back in those days. And I felt it necessary to take initiative then in getting students from Zambia to attend schools overseas. The first one for whom I made these arrangements was Mary Pandre, then known as Beara Pandre, who was a Kaonde from Chief Mumena's district, Chief Mumena's area in the Solwezi district. He spent a number of years in England taking courses in various areas. First of all, improving his English, going to the University of London to take a specialized course in English for non-English speaking students, and later taking courses in accountancy, which prepared him for I wouldn't say as a I don't think he became a chartered accountant, but he became some sort of an accountant, and he was equipped to enter the business world when he got back to Zambia. Another student that later came over was Kirkwood Achiumi, who had already gone through Munali Secondary School and matriculated there. He came first of all to McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where he did his pre-medical courses, went on to the University of Toronto, where he graduated as MD. He went back to Zambia for a short while and worked with the medical department of the government, but is now back in Canada, where he practices as a physician. When I arrived in Northern Rhodesia in 1944, and during the years that I worked there in the educational field, I think it's true to say that the colonial government of Northern Rhodesia had established very distinctive and firm patterns for the development of African education. As I said before, they were the ones who produced the syllabuses. They insisted on their implementation in schools, no matter by whom the schools were managed and operated. And so I think it's true to say that by 1944, and certainly in the years following it, all African education in Northern Rhodesia followed pretty well the same pattern and stereotype. I would think that it wouldn't matter where you went. You could go up into the northern province up near Abercorn, or you could come down to the Tonga country, Lusaka and south, or you could come out into our area or into the Big Bemba areas. It wouldn't matter too much, but whether you went to a Protestant or to a Catholic school run by this group or that group, you'd find substantially the same pattern of African education run along pretty well the same lines, with teachers trained in pretty well the same training schools. The question before me now is that of the changes which the church caused amongst traditional Kaundy society and customs. The first thing I'd like to say is that the changes turned out to be fairly substantial in the long haul, but that the changes caused by the missionary activity as such, in other words, its evangelizing activity, were somewhat different from those caused by its educational arm. I think it is true to say that the early missionaries, in particular those who preceded me, those who've gone out, let us say, in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, were primarily concerned with the evangelization of the Kaundy people and the establishment amongst them of Christian patterns of worship and life. Education was mainly considered to be a means whereby these new Christians could be taught to read biblically related materials and such portions of the New Testament as had been translated. The changes in the traditional Kaundy pattern of life, therefore, were such as have been caused by the presentation of the evangelical message to them. The traditional animistic belief in spirits was undoubtedly undermined. I think possibly we might almost say belittled and derided by some. No effort was lost in an effort, of course, to encourage the people in a belief in one God and in Jesus Christ, his Son, to expose what was held to be the fallacy of the animistic view of the cosmos. Moreover, there were some of the African customs which were held to be positively immoral by Christian standards and were therefore discouraged or forbidden in church circles. I suppose the most obvious of these would be polygamy. The female initiation rites also came under considerable displeasure of both of the mission and of the African leaders in the African church, which grew out of the missionary activity. And I have to admit that in the Kaondi area, no effort was made, except possibly to some extent by Miss Janetta Foreman at Mukingi, to Christianize these initiation rites. The thrust was rather to abolish them and let the girls grow up like most of the missionaries' children grow up, in relative ignorance of what it meant to be adolescent or to mature as a grown person. The Bakondi do have rites similar to those of the Bemba Chisungu rites, but these were, as I say, things which the Africans were encouraged to think upon as being more or less obscene and to be dropped. Indeed, any African Christian who allowed his daughter to go through Kisungu was at once disciplined by the church. In other areas, other much-loved customs of the Bakondi, such as the drinking of native-made beer on all occasions and others as well, was of course frowned upon, and possibly the missionaries were a little before their time here, since the imbibing of liquor has, I gather, become a major national disaster in the Zambia of today, and is now frowned upon not just by narrow-minded missionaries, but by sober national leaders from President Kaunda downwards. But however that may be, the drinking of beer was certainly a solid Kaunda custom associated with weddings and funerals and various times of the year, and that was something that was ruled out. I don't know where the Bakondi got their smoking habits from, but since the SAGM was an evangelical mission, that likewise came under the axe. Other things that underwent revision, if not abolition, was the lobola, or the bride price. I say discouragement, possibly, rather than abolition, or adjustments. I don't think the missionaries ever got to the point where they're willing to say that this was a non-Christian procedure. I think some missionaries may even have felt that there was a discouragement towards too much looseness in the marriage relationship. But, however, unreasonable bride prices, or anything more than a token lobola, I'd say was discouraged. In other areas of married life, radical changes were demanded by the evangelicals. For example, it was fairly common for a young man to have free sex relations with his first cousin, female, that is to say, and this, of course, was regarded as immoral and had to be ruled out. One area in which the church was not very vocal, at least not in my day, was the general relationship of a man to his wife, or a wife to her husband. Here the church seemed remarkably willing to leave the traditional relationship stand, and in church services, as I remember them, the men sat on one side of the church and the women on the other. The women, of course, taking charge of the children, so the men on one side, women and children on the other. I personally took the point of view that this was an element in the culture which there seemed to be no Christian reason to perpetuate, and part of our teaching on family life was that a man should stand by his wife and a wife should sit by her husband, and this we encouraged in the services in the church on the part of our African colleagues on the teaching staff. This aroused some considerable measure of opposition, both from some of my missionary colleagues and possibly even more from the older and more conservative Africans, who felt that I think there was a certain unnecessary undermining here of African cultural patterns. So much for the influence of the evangelizing missionaries on County society. I think it's true to say that the educational missionaries of the same society exercised a somewhat different influence on African culture. It goes without saying that the introduction of what was essentially a European, British-style educational system in Africa was itself the introduction of something capable of effecting a good deal of change. Education in and of itself was something that would be likely to undermine some of the basic, what I suppose we would call superstitions of the African people, weakening their sense of the significance of spirits, and as students went on further and further in the study of science on the one hand, or the history of man on the other, they came to set their own society in the context of the wider experience of the world. And I think it is true to say that young Africans came through their schooling with a somewhat supercilious view of the points of view of their fathers and certainly of their grandfathers. I think initially some of these changes were seen at fairly insignificant levels, however. One was the area of dress. As the upper middle school developed, I came to the conclusion that it would probably be better for the general development of the young people coming to the school if they ceased to wear garb which was neither traditionally African and certainly not traditionally European. It was basically bits and pieces picked up from here and there by young people who knew that they had to wear more than a string of beads, but really had no guidelines by which to purchase alternative clothing. And so rather than have them come in pairs of shorts of varying sizes and length, usually made out of 86-pound sugar bags, or have the boys come in various items of women's apparel, or wearing oversized boots that someone had lifted from one of their trips to the mines, and so on and so forth. In other words, the clothing which we didn't bother to smile at because there was so much of it you hardly noticed it, but which nevertheless didn't fit into any pattern of any sort, neither African nor European, and in view of the fact that they were, as educated Africans, likely now to proceed into a world greatly influenced by and probably to some extent controlled by our Western cultures. Therefore, we said, let us train them in the use of basic Western clothing. With this in view, we introduced school uniforms consisting of khaki shorts, khaki bush shirts, khaki socks, brown shoes, a simple and very neat set of clothing. This was welcomed by the Africans, I would say both older and younger, and indeed speedily became sort of standard pattern of dress for the Africans generally in the northwestern part of northern Rhodesia. It did not meet with warm approval from all missionaries of the SAGM. There was a fear on the part of some that it would cause the Africans to become too clothes conscious, to absorb with matters of their own personal appearance, to taken up with the Lulus of the affluent life, and so on and so forth. Also, the overriding concern of the evangelistic missionary was that there should grow up from amongst the younger group of Africans a new generation of rural teacher evangelists.